and good morning, everybody. It is me, Julian, and welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. Today, we're going to be answering the question, how to be yourself, according to Slavoj Žižek, which is to say, I'm going to try to give you a step-by-step guide as to Žižek's critique of what he calls the postmodern injunction par excellence, namely to be yourself. And at the end of this video, I'm going to try to explain how Žižek says you can actually be yourself. This is part of my ongoing lecture series on the concept of subjective destitution. And today we're going to be diving a little bit more deeply into the idea of identity and self-expression and what Žižek calls the antinomy of postmodern individuality. How the subject is caught between a desire to exempt himself from society, to be completely alone, versus the symbolic network as the ultimate platform for self-expression and individuation. But before I begin, I'd like to say thank you to everybody joining me live today. It makes me so happy that we have an international community of like-minded students and thinkers. So thank you for being here, and thank you to everybody who watches these lectures after the fact. If you'd like to support this channel, and if you'd like to learn more about Žižek's philosophy, please note that I'm continuing my ongoing Guide to Žižek ebook series, which is available exclusively on Patreon. You can download the first 10 volumes, or I think 11 if you count the one on Hegel, right now by going to Patreon. You can get the entire archives in a simple subscription form. Or if you'd like to stick around, you can get a new ebook that is released every 3 months. The most recent ebook, should you be curious, is titled The Silence of the Drives. Greetings to the Philippines. I see some commenters from the Philippines. Wonderful to see you here this morning. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to give you a 60-second version of this lecture. And then I'm going to break it down into a 30-minute version in which we're going to explore some of Žižek's critique of the idea of being yourself, how he talks about tattoos, etc., postmodern self-expression. So Žižek's basic argument is this. This is the 60-second version. Žižek says that the contemporary subject, the postmodern subject, has what he calls reflexive freedom, or indefinite plasticity, i.e. the postmodern subject has the freedom to create himself, i.e. to choose any mask he would like to wear, and yet this very freedom forces the postmodern subject to embrace a permanent refashioning of himself. In other words, the very freedom to be your most authentic self, to express your individuality, ties you to a successive sequence of performative refashionings by which you have to continuously seek your true self and then present it to others. Hence why for Žižek, the antinomy of postmodern individuality is that if you were to completely retreat from society to investigate the authentic core of yourself, you would become an idiot. But vice versa, if you present yourself in modern society as someone by means of your online identity, by means of the clothing that you wear, by means of the music you listen to, etc., you have to constantly refashion yourself so as to remain relevant, so as to perform authenticity. And so we're stuck. And Žižek says that this being stuck makes us depressed. It causes anxiety. We desperately want to assert our own individuality, and yet we suspect that the more we do so, the more we are actually conforming to a preconceived notion of what it means to be a person. Now, Žižek's solution, I'll give you the simple formula. Žižek's solution is a Lacanian one. He says, to be your true self is to sorry, I'm going to actually rephrase this. Žižek's solution, he says, the only way to be yourself is to accept the fundamental alienation in the symbolic network. The only way to be your true self is to accept the symbolic, to accept the fundamental alienation in the symbolic network. Now that's a pretty abstract formula. So what I'm going to try to do in this lecture is give you a step-by-step explanation using some accessible examples of what Žižek actually has in mind. What does it mean to accept the fundamental alienation in the symbolic network, or what Lacan calls traversing the fundamental fantasy? And perhaps in so doing, for those of you who have watched the previous lectures, I can also flesh out a little bit why Lacan's maxim about subjective destitution, or the transition from desire to drive, is not simply a self-help maxim about hustle culture. Perhaps we'll have time for that. Okay, so let's begin. I've already articulated that the antinomy of postmodern individuality is that the subject is caught in a double bind. On the one hand, he is free to assert himself to be an individual. He can listen to music, he can dress in interesting ways, he can fashion an identity for himself, and yet this very desire to be a person in life means that you conform to certain trends. It means that you have to first figure out what it is that you like and what you would like to be identified by. The car you wear, the watch you wear, the clothes you wear, etc. In other words, you fashion for yourself a persona that is supposed to express your authenticity, your individuality, and yet nothing could be more conformist than this very process. In fact, one of the ironies of postmodern existence is that to be rebellious by means of wearing, let's say, Che Guevara shirts is precisely the most conformist gesture. What you might call the commodification of resistance is the norm within postmodern societies. This is something that the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig once called the mechanization of modern life. How everything becomes more and more the same precisely under the guise of being open and free and diversified. Now, how do we break free from this? Žižek has a pretty interesting argument. He says, one way to think about this is about the subject's relationship to the symbolic order. One of the Lacanian maxims or ideas is that the big other, that which guarantees the functioning of the symbolic order, is neither subjective nor objective. Which is to say, it's not simply that the subject submits himself to the symbolic order as a kind of pre-crafted universe that gives the subject meaning, nor is it, for that matter, that the big other is something which forces the subject into submission. Instead, the subject creates the symbolic order by means of its interrelationship with it. To give you an example, Žižek argues that we can see something similar when it comes to tattoos and piercings. One of the fundamental inversions of postmodern life is that it used to be that a tattoo or a piercing was something that signaled your resistance to the symbolic order. I refuse to participate in normative social life, and the way in which I'm going to mark or signify my resistance is by means of having a visible tattoo or a piercing. Now, in today's society, in most industries, the prohibition against tattoos and piercings has actually gone away. In fact, it's become quite normal, in fact, even mainstream, to have piercings and tattoos, to the extent that not having a piercing or a tattoo in certain environments might itself be considered a form of resistance. Vice versa, as societies have become more permissive, as it's become easier to find romantic relationships and, if you will, amorous encounters, although perhaps it's the other way around, the easier it is to find amorous encounters, the harder it is to find meaningful relationships. The more promiscuous a society becomes, in the sense that it has more access to these encounters, the more it becomes an act of resistance to have a long-lasting relationship with one person. That monogamy, which used to be the norm, and polygamy was, in a sense, the exception, now almost inverts. Not that everyone is a polygamist, but that we assert our freedom by means of not binding ourselves to one person and simply being available for multiple amorous encounters. And amidst this scenario, to dedicate yourself completely to one person paradoxically becomes a form of resistance, an exception to the norm. And so an inversion takes place, and this inversion localizes itself around the relationship that the subject has to the symbolic order. Consider the young person who gets a piercing or a tattoo. Instead of demonstrating their resistance to the symbolic, namely, I will do something which makes me a pariah, they actually submit to the symbolic. They get a piercing, thereby signaling that they are hip and cool and relevant like their peers. Žižek goes a step further, because of course this is a generalization. He goes a step further and makes a formal argument about a triad between pre-modern societies, modern societies, and postmodern societies in relationship to what he calls the cut. And if you're curious, this is an argument that Žižek makes in the ticklish subject, his follow-up to the sublime object of ideology. And he refers to it as the triad of pre-modern cut, the modern absence of cut, and the postmodern return to the cut on page 458. So what exactly is the cut? Well, Žižek makes an interesting argument. He says, in a pre-modern society, like a pagan society, a subject was marked by means of a tattoo or some tribal inscription, war paint, etc., so as to mark their participation in the symbolic order, their submission to the symbolic, to the tribal leaders and to its deities. However, in a modern society, this cut actually disappears. We see the Judaic and Christian prohibition against tattoos and against making this pagan mark. Instead, the mark or the cut is transcribed back into the deity itself. After all, one could identify Christianity as an entire cult of the mark, Christ as the marked one, as the cut one who was cut on our behalf, so that we no longer need to be cut. And the, if you will, Protestant renunciation, the idea of working hard and renunciating earthly pleasures, etc., becomes itself a way of symbolizing this cut. Hence, the modern society, the society of Christianity and Protestantism, the pre-industrial society, essentially transposes the cut from the body of the pagan subject into the institution of the symbolic order, the religious society itself. This is followed by the postmodern cut. And the postmodern cut is one in which the subject once again appears, although only nominally so, to return to the pagan gesture, namely to inflict the cut or the wound upon its own body. And yet now in the inverse form. Whereas the pagan body was marked or cut so that it might be inscribed into the symbolic order, become a member of the tribe, the postmodern body inflicts a wound or a cut upon itself so as to signal its non-inscription into social life, i.e. the postmodern subject who signals his resistance to the status quo and the symbolic order by means of this cut. Žižek says that to simplify somewhat, the pagan pre-modern society stages the cut as a means of transitioning from the real to the symbolic, whereas the postmodern subject stages the transition by means of the cut from the symbolic to the real, the authentic core of the subject that is supposed to be expressed against the backdrop of the big other. However, there is a crucial thing to be observed here that I have not brought up, which is to say the big other is missing in the postmodern social network. Which is to say, in the pre-modern pagan network, the subject is inscribed into the big other by means of being cut. Whereas in the modern society, the big other is operative without the cut, i.e. the cut has been transposed into the big other as such. However, the postmodern subject lives without the big other. There is only cut. And the only cut, therefore, is precisely a marker as to the radical non-existence of the big other as such, asserting against this backdrop, this void, the supposed autonomy of the subject. And yet, this is where the paradox of individuation, which it calls the antinomy of postmodern individuality, occurs. Let's cite Žižek in his own words on page 459 of the ticklish subject. He writes, "The ultimate paradox of individuation, however, is that this complete dependence on others, I am what I am only through my relations with others, generates the opposite effect of drug dependence, in which I am dependent not on another subject, but on a drug that directly provides excessive jouissance." Now, let's bench that for a moment. I'll return to that for a moment. This antinomy can also be formulated as the antinomy between the simulacrum of the masks you wear, of the roles you play in the game of intersubjective relationships, and the real, of traumatic bodily violence and cuts. The key point here is to assert the Hegelian speculative identity between these two opposites. The price of the global reign of simulacra is extreme violence to the bodily realm. This is actually a really important passage, although it's quite dense. Žižek basically says that there is an antinomy between simulacra, namely the supposed freedom by which you can wear multiple masks, signaling how you are nominally free for others. And yet, this is supposed to be juxtaposed with the absence of violence. I am free, I am not violently suppressed because I can express myself. And yet, Žižek says that that it should be seen as the other way around. The ultimate form of violence that is cast upon or inflicted upon the subject is precisely the hollow form, the emptiness of the simulacra as such. Which is to say, to put it in a somewhat more simple formula, instead of saying that we are free because we can express ourselves in our full individuality, we are precisely unfree. We are nominally free. We are anxious and depressed precisely because we have the supposed freedom to be anyone or do anything. What Kierkegaard once characterized as a kind of anxiety, namely the anxiety of being free, the anxiety of being free to do anything. And yet this freedom isn't true freedom. It is precisely a freedom that binds us. The more free you are to express yourself by means of individuation, fashion, piercings, etc., the less free you feel, the less fulfilled you feel. And it is against the backdrop of this that regressive figures of paternal authority, such as Jordan Peterson, present themselves as a meaningful escape from the supposed freedom. In fact, the reactionary turn suggests that postmodern life is regressive. Therefore, we must return to traditional patriarchal authority so as to find meaning and purpose once again. However, Žižek's argument is that instead of staging a return to a modern or pre-modern mode of existence, the only way forward is through. After all, the absence of the big other cannot be substituted or supplemented by the imposition of a false consciousness big other, of a parental tyrannical figure who tells you what to do and how to live. Hence, for Žižek, the only mode of emancipation, i.e. the only way in which you can be free, is to go through this very antinomy, not to turn away and move back. And this is where we can see, to go back to the passage that I had, the ultimate paradox of individuation, however, is that this complete dependence on others, I am what I am only through my relations with others, generates the opposite effect of drug dependence, in which I am dependent not on another subject, but on a drug that directly provides excessive jouissance. Which is to say, the entire thing goes back to how can I feel pleasure? How can I feel enjoyment? And the problem is that the contemporary postmodern subject of excess is no longer able to feel pleasure. Namely, everything comes too easily to him. Therefore, the temptation is to renounce said pleasure, to give yourself completely to discipline, to the submission to a figure of paternal authority. Therefore, in this very submission, the slave mentality, as it were, to once again be able to enjoy. Hence, from a Lacanian perspective, the problem is the problem of enjoyment. How can we access enjoyment if our very enjoyment has become our ethical imperative, our duty, as it were? What Marcuse once referred to as a repressive desublimation, how your id and giving into your id becomes itself the superego injunction. Now, I want to take a step back for a moment because I know that I'm going very fast and I'm introducing a lot of jargon. One of the contemporary ideological motifs is that we are told to take a step back, to think about who we really are. The problem is that we are alienated, we are working jobs that we don't necessarily enjoy, we're living a life that we don't necessarily find fulfilling, we are aware of our mortality, that time is running out, and so we are told that what we should do is we should take a step back, do a little bit of nothing, as it were. In fact, introspection is ironically the very mode of ideological submission or coercion that takes place within postmodern societies. To simplify somewhat, within a pre-postmodern society, oppression is overt. Namely, you are going to be a worker, you're going to be a quasi-slave, you're going to be somebody who goes to church, you have to do X, you have no choice, you are oppressed. What takes place within postmodern society is that this oppression is essentially outsourced to yourself. You're aware of the fact that you have to make something of yourself, that you have to assert your individuality somehow, that you have to use social media for career advancement, etc. You have to learn to tell a story and present yourself. Like, young children are taught at schools from a very young age how to quote unquote sell themselves, how to turn your life story into a commodity that can be marketed to a public of buyers, as it were. In fact, if you apply for jobs, you're expected to essentially sell yourself. What value do you bring to your corporation, etc.? And so you start seeing yourself as essentially this entity that has high value or low value, that is something that can be shaped and fashioned as an ideal commodity to be used by others. And ironically, this very process is sold back to you as your ultimate emancipation. That you are free because you can shape your own narrative in your story and you can move up in the ranks. And ironically, and I think this is actually quite important, the message that you'll get from self-help gurus, including figures such as Jordan Peterson, is actually fully in sync with this ideology of exploitation. Namely, how can you become a high-value individual? How can you sell yourself on the market of intersexual relationships, or when it comes to being someone in a high-paying job, etc.? This very idea that your true self is something malleable, which with sufficient discipline and drive can be constructed into something that will yield high returns, is itself a symptom of capitalist excess. It presents itself as the antidote to it, as the secret sauce by means of which you can escape it. And yet it is precisely the continuation of its very internal logic. It is capitalism by other means. In fact, this is true when it comes to like self-help gurus who tell you the secret to great wealth, etc. There is no secret to great wealth. The thing about capitalism is that it wears it on its sleeve. Anyone can learn the basic mechanisms of market exploitation, of a rent society, a society of debt. And people are told that the secret to get rich is to take on loans so as to buy property and then to rent them out to other people, take more loans, buy more property to franchise your very existence, etc. There's nothing secret about this. And yet this is precisely sold back to people as democratization. Anyone can do it. You're an idiot if you don't do it. If it is totally transparent, then the only one to blame for not becoming rich is you. This basic pitch from the supposed emancipators of society, the democratizers of wealth and success, is the very pitch of capitalism. The idea that your individuality is what will make you successful. That as long as you spend enough time grinding it out and studying the industry, you will rise up in the ranks. And it's not untrue. It's not untrue that you can do this. The rate of success is relatively low, but it is possible, of course. The problem, however, is that this individuation is simply the most common way of participation. There's a reason why these videos are the highest ranked on YouTube. It's because everybody watches them, and yet very few people actually do something with them. Now, this is where we have to go back to Žižek's own advice. Žižek, of course, is hardly a self-help theorist, and yet I think if you read him closely, you can realize that there's a lot more value and worth in some of his philosophical arguments than there are in some of the platitudes of self-help gurus. In fact, Žižek writes, the way to be yourself is to accept the fundamental alienation in the symbolic network. To put that very simply, Žižek says the most authentic thing that you can do or think, the most authentic act, is precisely to realize that there is no authentic you. That to truly be yourself is to reject the notion of being yourself. Now, if only it were so easy, of course. If only we were simply saying, well, there is no authentic core, and therefore I've achieved my authentic core. This would simply be another mask that you can wear, the mask of the sort of rhetorical philosopher. And yet, there's a much more intricate argument at work here. It's essentially a Lacanian refashioning of the maxim that in order to be free, you must traverse the fundamental fantasy, which rhymes quite nicely, right? Okay, Let me explain. In some of my previous lectures, you might have gained a suspicion that the way in which I was presenting subjective destitution seemed to align all too closely with a certain self-help mantra, that the transition from desire to drive, chasing an empty object of desire, had to be transposed into drive as such, or the simple self-help mantra that it is not the reward but the journey that counts. However, what I've been keeping from you, which some of you may have already suspected, is that there's actually a more intricate layer to this. Lacan's argument about the transition from desire to drive, from loss to lack, isn't actually about drive, about how you're happy when you're hustling. Instead, there's a secondary argument, which is this. Lacan's argument is that underneath every drive is a fantasy that allows the subject to sustain his drive. There's a wonderful scene from one of my favorite comedies called Peep Show, where there's an exploited office worker who's told by his boss that he has to stay up all night, basically doing rote bureaucratic work. And he puts on a playlist of James Bond soundtracks, and he says to himself, I'm going to pretend that I am James Bond and that this is a secret mission that I have to work through the night. And he gets really amped up about it, like he really enjoys it. Here we have the Lacanian argument that underneath every drive is a fantasy which has to be sustained. In other words, the subject can enjoy his drive only to the extent that he has a fantasy that is not disrupted. And this is actually quite key, because a lot of aggression, I think, comes when people sense that their fantasy is going to be undermined, that the governing reason or logic by which they are able to sustain their oppression is at risk of coming undone. It's why people cling on to their oppression, why they cling on to their exploitation, because their very libidinal framework, their fantasy, the reason, the fantasy by which they create a reason for their own existence would fall away. Lacan's very aware of this. He says, if you lose your drive, i.e. if the fantasy that sustains the drive is interrupted, the subject itself disintegrates. Hence, the subject clings on to its fantasy and to its drive, and thereby to its exploitation. The Lacanian imperative, therefore, the message, the advice, is to change the fantasy so that you might change the drive, so that the fantasy and the drive is a fantasy and drive of your own choosing. Not simply, I've come up with a fantastical framework, phantasmatic framework, by which I can sustain my drive on behalf of the other, but a phantasmatic drive that sustains me, that I have created for myself. Granted, you are still subject to fantasy. You are still subject to the other, but at least this is in a way of your own choosing. And I think that this is actually really key and easily lost. When Lacan argues that you have to stage a transition from desire to drive, he's not simply advocating for hustle culture, like, you should just work hard and find satisfaction in the journey, etc. What he's really advocating for is that you take a very close look at what the hidden phantasmatic framework is that sustains your drive, and whether or not this hidden phantasmatic framework is one of exploitation or emancipation, or, if you will, exploitation or self-exploitation. To go back to arguments from self-help gurus and figures like Jordan Peterson, their narrative appears at first glance to resemble that of Lacan, namely, embrace drive and meaning and purpose, reject the postmodern antinomy of alienated individuality, etc. And yet it's a regressive narrative that sells you a drive whose very incentive structure is nevertheless entirely subject to capitalist exploitation and to the exploitation of others. To my mind, one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson presents as so angry with a barely contained rage is precisely that to hold on to the set of rules that he and his followers have cultivated makes one extremely fragile to the disintegration of one's fantasy. Anyone who undermines one's fantasy, therefore undermines one's drive, hence undermines the very existence of the Petersonian subject. Hence, this makes you very vulnerable. It makes you very prone to castration. Anything that can be said or done, whether it's transgender rights or the assertion of individual postmodern freedoms, suddenly becomes an existential threat to the subject of Petersonian drive. Now, how do we emancipate ourselves from this? How do we find a drive that actually feels, if you will, more wholesome, more loving, more open, more productive, less destructive. One way to do so is to be completely entirely honest about the nature of fantasy and drive. We need drive in order to exist. We need the semblance of purpose in order to keep on going. And yet we vacillate between, on the one hand, I am completely myself versus I am for others. If you're completely yourself, you become an idiot. If you simply live for others, you become their slave. And we're constantly bouncing around back and forth. It's very easy in one day to be happy and despairing at the same time, or perhaps alternating. To be a contemporary modern subject is to exist in this vacillating of the semblances, as Žižek likes to put it, which is the existence without a big other. And here, I think, to conclude this lecture, I'd like to go back to page 458 of Žižek's argument, which has a lengthy footnote. And he says, in postmodern society, we have the cut, but without the big other. It is thus only in postmodern society that the loss of the big other, the substantial symbolic order, is fully consummated. In it, we return to the feature that characterizes the first phase. There is again a cut in the body. But this cut now stands for the exact opposite of the first phase. That is to say, it signals not the inscription into the big other, but its radical non-existence. To put that more simply, in a postmodern society, we are the cut. The cut is us. We are not simply cutting ourselves, we are the very embodiment of this gap, of this void. And this is a difficult and painful thing to experience. It means that we're all in different ways hurting. We're all looking for some sense of purpose and meaning. And there are ways to find that purpose and meaning. Perhaps it begins by embracing the lack of meaning. Perhaps it begins by embracing the lack of finite, definite solutions. But I believe that if we are loving, if we are caring, if we are nurturing towards others, it is easier for us to be loving and nurturing and caring to ourselves. The more we give, the more we receive. Instead to bunker down and to fully give yourself to your drive, to say that any attack on your phantasmatic framework is an attack on yourself, is to become a repressive subject, is to become a subject of anger and repression, and a reactionary subject who sees any form of change as an attack on his very existence. To be open to change is precisely to accept that, fundamentally, the one truth about the subject is that the subject exists in interconnection with others. That, as Žižek puts it, I'll repeat this for the third time, the only way to be yourself is to accept the fundamental alienation in the symbolic network, not to fight it, not to think that you are the last bastion fighting against this alienation, to accept that the fundamental alienation is constitutive of the symbolic network and vice versa. And we, as its alienated subjects, therefore have the power and we have the freedom to think about different ways of living that we can achieve collectively. And so the way to be yourself isn't to hunker down and try to protect the supposed phantasmatic framework of your identity against others. It is to realize that your identity is shaped in and through your interaction with others, which gives you, if at best, a minimal semblance of agency, at worst, the responsibility to do something with yourself. All right, thank you guys so much. That is Žižek's advice on how to be yourself, or what he calls the antinomy of postmodern individuality. If you'd like to learn more about this, you can see my other lectures in this series. They're all thematically connected. Or if you'd like to read my Guide to Žižek ebook series, which is ongoing, you can download volumes 1 through 11 by simply becoming a patron. I'm also going to be hosting a bonus Discord seminar, which I do every week, and also I post that as a podcast to my Patreon in about 5 minutes. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you next week.